The spring mud had not yet dried on the path between the cabins when Edna Walsh came carrying her jar of beef broth and her face full of practiced grief. She had seen enough Montana winters to know what they left behind: the sunken eyes, the cracked lips, the particular silence of a house that had been too cold for too long. She had buried a neighbor's child the previous March and helped pack up another family's belongings in February, and she knew how to arrange her expression before she knocked on a door. She knocked on Ruth Calloway's door that April morning, prepared for the worst. What she found instead stopped her on the threshold. Lily was sitting on the split log bench outside the cabin, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, reading aloud from a primer to her younger brother Thomas, who was crouched in the mud beside the steps, constructing something architectural out of small stones and pine cones. Neither child looked up immediately. They were not hollow-eyed. They were not gray at the cheeks. Lily's fingers wrapped around the spine of the book were pink and unbroken. Thomas's hands pressing stones into the wet earth were the hands of a child who had not spent a winter pressing them against his own chest for warmth. Edna stood there with her jar of broth going cold in her grip and could not immediately account for what she was seeing. Ruth appeared in the doorway behind them, a coffee cup in one hand, her white hair pinned back with the same 3-iron pins she had used every morning for the past decade. She looked tired in the way that all of them looked tired that spring, the kind of tired that had settled into bone and would take until June to lift. But she was standing, she was upright, she had coffee. Edna's carefully arranged expression of sympathy had nowhere useful to go. That was April. This story begins in October. The cabin sat at the northern edge of the Bitterroot Creek settlement at an elevation where the aspens went yellow 2 weeks before the ones in the valley below. Ruth had lived in it for 11 years, first with her husband Harold, then without him, and now with 2 children who were not technically hers, but who called her grandma, with the ease of children who had never been offered another option. The cabin measured 14 feet by 18. The logs were well chinked with a mixture of clay and dried moss that Harold had packed tight before the first winter, and that Ruth had repacked twice since. The fireplace was river stone, wide-throated, and drew smoke reliably in all but the worst wind. The floor was rough sawn planks laid over cedar posts that raised the living surface 6 inches above the ground. On paper, any man in the settlement would have called it a sound cabin. Ruth had spent enough winters in it to know what the paper did not say. By late October of 1887, the frost had begun forming on the underside of the floorboards before it formed on the outside of the windows. That was the first sign. The second sign was the way the cold moved, not sliding down from the ceiling or seeping through the walls, the way a drafty cabin's cold behaved, but rising steadily from below as though the earth itself had decided to push winter upward through the wood. Ruth had known this problem in previous years and had managed it well enough when it was only herself in the cabin. But Lily was 9 now and Thomas was 6, and the previous summer had changed the arithmetic of everything. Her daughter Ellen had died in July. The typhoid had come through the valley in early June, moving from the lower settlements upward along the creek, and it had taken 3 people before it took Ellen. Ruth had been a field nurse during the last 2 years of the Civil War, had worked the field hospitals at Spotsylvania and Cold Harbor, had dressed wounds that would have turned a civilian's stomach inside out without blinking, and none of it had prepared her for watching her own daughter burn through 4 days of fever and go still on the 5th morning, with the sun coming through the window and the birds making their ordinary noise outside. Ellen's husband had stayed for the burial and then left first to Missoula on what he called business, and then it became clear to somewhere that was not coming back from. Ruth had packed the children's few things into her wagon and driven them up the hill to her cabin in a single trip, and she had not spoken about Ellen again since the day she told the children that their mother was gone. She thought about Ellen every day. She thought about her in the way that grief becomes a habit, not a fresh wound each time, but a familiar weight that you learn to carry without putting down. Now it was October, and the children were coughing. Not badly, not yet. Thomas had developed the particular wet sound in his chest that came from sleeping cold, and Lily had taken to curling her fingers into her palms each morning before she got out of bed, trying to bring the feeling back into them before she faced the floor. Ruth watched this and said nothing, but she began running through her inventory of options, the way she had once run through her medical supply inventory before a long campaign, methodically without panic, with the clear-eyed accounting of a person who cannot afford to miss anything. She packed straw beneath the floorboards in the first week of November, crawling under the cabin in the cold, with a lantern and an old grain sack stuffing the dry stalks into every gap she could reach. The straw helped for approximately 4 days before the wind found it and packed it against the foundation where it did nothing at all. She hung canvas along the inside of the foundation walls, tacking it with salvaged nails, and the canvas cut the worst of the drafts for about a week before the freezing and thawing of the ground began to pull the tacks loose. She burned bigger fires, which meant burning through her woodpile at a rate she had not budgeted for, and still the cold came up through the planks as steadily and patiently as though it had nowhere else to be. She sat at her table on a Sunday evening in early November, with her tallow candle burning down to its last inch, and her pencil moving across the back of a flour sack listing things she knew. Heat rises. Wind strips heat from surfaces. The space beneath the cabin acts as a channel for the wind, and that wind moves along the underside of the floor like water through a mill race, pulling warmth down and away before it can do any good. The walls were solid. The chimney was sound. The problem was not in the structure of the cabin. The problem was in the space between the cabin and the ground, that 6-inch gap Harold had built to protect the floorboards from moisture, which had in the meantime become a highway for cold air, moving at 15 miles an hour on a calm night and considerably faster when the weather turned. She had seen this problem solved before, though not in Montana, and not in any way the settlement's men would have recognized as applicable. In the winter of 1863, she had worked a field hospital set up in a partially collapsed barn outside Fredericksburg, and the Army surgeons had ordered the men to dig the floor of the barn down 2 feet below the surrounding grade and bank the outer walls with earth. The result had been a structure that held heat in a way that no amount of extra blankets could replicate, not because of the fire inside, but because the ground itself had stopped being the enemy and started being an ally. The earth 2 or 3 feet down did not follow the weather. It held its temperature the way a stone holds the warmth of the afternoon sun, slowly, steadily, indifferent to what the air above it was doing. She had also seen years earlier the semi-subterranean winter shelters built by Shoshone families she had encountered near the Snake River during a long journey west, structures that were half buried in hillsides walled with stone and insulated with bark that stayed livable through temperatures that collapsed the canvas tents of every white settlement within 50 miles. She had filed this observation away the way she filed away all useful observations in the part of her mind that was always quietly running calculations about survival. She was 63 years old. Her back hurt in the mornings. The bursitis in her left hip had gotten worse since September. She was not the person she had been at 30 or 40 or even 55. She had one good arm, her right, and one arm that would give her trouble if she pushed it too hard, and she had 2 children whose health was her only non-negotiable responsibility in the world. She folded the flour sack and put it in her apron pocket and went to bed. She lay awake for a long time listening to the wind move under the floor, and she stopped thinking about how to fight it. She started thinking about what would happen if she simply went below it. The idea took its final shape not from inspiration, but from a near disaster. 3 mornings after she had laid out her calculations on the flour sack, Ruth woke before dawn to put wood on the fire. The cabin was at its coldest hour. The fire had burned down to coals and the temperature had dropped through the night to somewhere around 10 degrees outside, and the floorboards near the door wore a thin rime of frost that had crept up from below. She was wearing her wool socks and she was moving carefully the way she always moved in the dark, but the frost had reached the section of floor between the woodpile and the stove, and her left foot went forward instead of down, and before she had any time to account for what was happening, she was falling. She hit the edge of the stone hearth with her right shoulder. Not her head, not her spine, her shoulder. The impact was hard enough to knock the breath out of her and leave her lying on the cold floor staring at the ceiling, and she lay there for a moment taking inventory of her body the way she had been trained to do, checking sensation in her fingers and her toes and her neck before she tried to move. Nothing was broken. The shoulder was bruised badly enough that lifting her arm above waist height made her eyes water, and it would stay that way for the next 2 weeks. She got herself upright and fed the fire and stood in front of it until her hands stopped shaking. The children had not woken. She could hear Thomas breathing from behind the curtain that separated their sleeping area from the main room, and the sound was wet and slow. The sound of a child whose lungs were working harder than they should, to do a job that lungs at his age should manage without effort. Ruth stood in front of the fire and looked at the space where she had fallen and understood something that had not fully landed before. She was not 32. She was not 40. She was 63 years old and she was alone, and she had just fallen on a frozen floor in the middle of the night. And if that fall had gone 2 inches differently, she might be lying there now with a cracked skull or a broken spine, and Lily and Thomas would have woken up in a cold cabin next to their grandmother's body on a November morning with no one within shouting distance to help them. She did not have unlimited tries. She did not have the luxury of learning from serious mistakes. She had one body that was already asking questions it hadn't been asking 5 years ago, and she had two children whose survival was entirely contingent on that body continuing to function. The calculation was simple. The floor would keep killing her and them by degrees slowly through cold and exhaustion, and the accumulated deficit of too little sleep and too much fire tending unless she changed the fundamental conditions of the problem. And she would keep falling on frozen floorboards in the dark until she fell in a way that she did not get up from unless she changed those conditions too. Before dawn the following morning, while Lily and Thomas slept, she pried up 3 floorboards in the northwest corner of the cabin, the corner that sat directly below where the children slept away from the door's drafts backed against the solid earth of the slope. The frozen ground beneath was iron hard and smelled of cold clay and old roots. She drove the tip of her spade into it and felt the resistance travel up through the handle into her good arm. She began. The digging went slowly at first. The top few inches of ground had frozen to a depth that required the spade to be forced rather than pressed, and Ruth worked in short sessions of 30 minutes at a time, stopping when her shoulder protested too sharply or when she heard one of the children stir overhead. She carried the loosened dirt out in a canvas meal sack and spread it thin across the kitchen garden, where the snow had not yet covered the soil entirely thin enough that a passing eye would not catch the freshness of it, thin enough to look like nothing more than turned earth. She had thought about this carefully. She did not want questions. By the 3rd day, the ground softened below the frost line, and the work became faster. By the end of the first week, she had cleared 18 inches of depth across a space roughly 4 feet square. Her hands had developed new blisters over old ones, and she had learned to wrap them with strips of flannel before she took up the spade each morning. The shoulder ached steadily but did not worsen. She worked with the deliberate economy of someone who has learned not to waste motion, not because she was naturally efficient, but because the Civil War had taught her that the difference between a nurse who lasted and one who burned out in 3 months was the ability to work within her own physical limits without apologizing for them. She had planned the dimensions with care. 8 feet long, 6 feet wide, 4.5 feet from floor to ceiling, enough for her to sit upright and tend to a child without hunching, not tall enough to stand in, which was fine because standing was not the point. The walls would be lined with stone-rounded granite and dark basalt she had been pulling from the Bitterroot Creek bed since September, telling herself she was improving the garden border and believing it right up until the moment she understood what they were actually for. The floor would be wooden planking raised a few inches above the earth on cedar posts for drainage and to keep the cold of the bare ground from coming up through sleeping bodies. There would be a vent pipe angled upward at 15 degrees exiting through the foundation wall, disguised at the exterior as a drainage outlet. And there would be a trapdoor 2 feet square hinge set into the cabin floor and covered by the braided rag rug that had been in this cabin since Harold laid the first plank. She understood what she was doing in terms that had nothing to do with innovation and everything to do with physics as she had observed it over 6 decades of living. 5 feet below the surface of the Montana ground, the temperature remained around 50 degrees Fahrenheit regardless of what the air above was doing. That was not a guess or a hope. She had pushed an iron rod into the creek bank in January 3 years running and felt the difference herself. The earth at depth was a thermal battery slow to change, enormous in mass, indifferent to seasons. If she could build a space that connected to that mass walled with stone that would absorb and hold heat insulated against the wind, that was the real thief of warmth positioned below the cabin floor, so that the heat generated by the fireplace above would radiate down through the wood and be captured rather than lost, then she could give her children a place to sleep that the winter could not reach. The heat would go down. The carpenter's lore said otherwise, but the carpenter's lore was built on the behavior of heat in open spaces where convection carried it upward and away. In a sealed underground room, convection had nowhere to go. The heat would sink into the stone walls. The stone would give it back slowly through the night. The vent would allow just enough air exchange to keep the space breathable without creating the airflow that killed warmth. She had explained this to no one, not because she was hiding the reasoning, but because she had not been asked. The settlement's men gave advice. They did not, as a general practice, ask a 63-year-old widow what she was thinking. On a Tuesday in the second week of November, Deputy Mercer arrived on horseback to collect the winter land use filings that the territorial government required of every claim holder along the creek. He was a tall man with a neat brown beard, in the particular manner of a government official who considered himself reasonable, which in Ruth's experience meant he would be reasonable precisely as far as the forms required and not 1 inch further. He dismounted at her fence post, tied his horse, and came to the door with his leather satchel and his notebook. Ruth met him on the steps. He went through the standard questions, acreage, livestock improvements made in the previous 12 months, and wrote her answers in his careful clerk's hand. Then he looked past her toward the kitchen garden and the thin scatter of fresh-turned soil that lay along its western edge, darker than the frozen ground around it. "Mrs. Calloway," his pencil hovered, "have you made any structural modifications to the cabin or its foundation in the past quarter?" Ruth looked at him directly. "I've been attending to some drainage issues under the floor. The spring melt came through the northwest corner last year." He wrote something. Then he looked at the garden again, and at the slight unevenness of the soil where she had spread the excavated dirt, and at the single smear of clay on her apron that she had not noticed. He was not a stupid man. She had not expected him to be. "Any modifications that affect the load-bearing structure or the foundation depth need to be filed with the Territorial Land Office before work begins." He said it pleasantly. He said it the way a man says something he has said many times and expects to say many more. "That's for homestead claims filed under the 1862 Act, which yours is." "I understand." Ruth kept her voice as pleasant as his. "I'll keep that in mind." He studied her for a moment with the expression of a man deciding whether to press a point or let it go, and then he made the same calculation men in his position usually made when the alternative was a further conversation with an elderly woman who had not invited him in. He nodded, made a final notation, and tucked his pencil away. "The office is open Mondays and Wednesday," he said. "First filing period ends December 15th. She watched him ride back down the path toward the Holt property, and when he had gone far enough that his horse's breath was only a distant vapor, in the cold air, she went inside, moved the rug, opened the section of floor she had pried up, and climbed down to continue digging. The stones she had collected over the previous months were stacked in the woodshed under a covering of spare shingles, 43 stones in total, ranging from fist size to the weight of a good-sized watermelon, all of them pulled from the Bitterroot Creek bed, where the water had been working on them for longer than the settlement had existed. Granite was her preference for the walls dense enough to hold heat, stable enough not to crack in the freeze-thaw cycle. The darker basalt she used at the base where the thermal mass mattered most. She had carried them up from the creek in September in her wagon 2 or 3 at a time, telling herself and anyone who asked that she was adding to the garden border, which was a true enough statement to sit easy on her conscience. Laying the walls was slower than digging and required a different kind of attention. She could not afford to rush the chinking. Each stone had to be seated firmly against its neighbors, the gaps filled with a mixture of clay and dry pine needles that she had prepared in a pail kept by the trapdoor. A poorly set wall would shift under the weight of the soil behind it, and a shifting wall in an underground space would not announce itself with a gentle warning. She had seen what unsupported earthen walls did in the field hospital excavations. They waited until the moment of greatest pressure, and then they moved decisively and without apology. She had nearly finished the third course of the eastern wall on a Saturday afternoon in late November when she heard the sound. It was not loud. It was a quiet preliminary sound like the first settling of a green log on a fire, a soft creak, and then a lower, slower groan from somewhere behind and above the unfinished section of the north wall. She turned and looked up in time to see the dark stripe of a crack open in the earthen wall above the incomplete stonework, and then the section let go. It came down slowly enough that she had time to press herself against the southern wall before the earth and the upper stones came forward into the space she had just vacated. The impact threw dust and cold air and a sound that was more felt than heard. And when it settled, she was standing in the partial dark. Her lantern had survived wedged into its alcove, with a section of collapsed wall blocking the lower third of the space and a cold weight pressing against her right boot. She looked down. A stone roughly the size of a cookpot had come to rest against her foot. Not on it, against it. She stepped back and tested the foot and found it unhurt. She stood in the dust and the lamplight for a long moment. There was no one to call. There was no one who would come if she called. Lily and Thomas were in the cabin above her, and she could hear very faintly the sound of Thomas dragging something across the floor in whatever construction project had claimed his afternoon, the same ordinary sound she had been listening for as a pulse check throughout the weeks of digging, the sound that meant both children were warm and occupied and unaware. She was 63 years old, and she was standing alone in a partially collapsed underground room that no one in the settlement knew existed, and her shoulder still ached from a fall 3 weeks ago, and her right hand had a blister on the palm that had opened and resealed twice in the past week, and the pile of earth between her and the ladder was going to take 40 minutes to clear with the small shovel she kept down here for finish work. She stood in the lantern light and looked at the collapsed section, and then looked up through the gap in the floor above where the lamplight from the cabin came through in a thin yellow bar. Through it, she could see the edge of the braided rug. She could hear Thomas's feet. She picked up the small shovel. The clearing took 45 minutes. She rebuilt the failed section differently, setting the base stones deeper and tying them back to the finished eastern wall with a course of wedge stones that created a brace. It was not the design she had intended. It was better. Necessity had a way of being a better architect than planning. George Holt came by on a Wednesday. He was the best carpenter in the Bitterroot Creek settlement, which was a meaningful distinction in a place where the quality of your woodwork was the quality of your winter. He was not a cruel man, and he did not say what he said to wound her. He said it the way a man says something he genuinely believes, with the easy confidence of someone whose expertise has been confirmed so many times that alternative information has stopped registering as information. He had been riding past the property when he noticed the thin scatter of fresh soil in the garden, and he had pulled up at the fence because he was a careful man, and fresh soil in November was the kind of detail that made careful men curious. Ruth told him briefly what she was building and why. He laughed. Not unkindly, not even dismissively. It was the laugh of a man who finds something impractical in a way that he considers harmless. Mrs. Calloway, heat goes up. That's not an opinion, that's how a chimney works. You put a warm space under your floor, the warm air comes straight up through the planks and out through every gap in your roof before it does anyone any good. He said he had been building in this climate for 30 years, and he had never seen a cold floor problem solved by digging down. He recommended an additional layer of insulation batted tight between the floor joists and offered to help her fit it on Saturday. Ruth thanked him for the offer and declined it. He shook his head with the particular expression of a man who has given good advice to a woman and had it politely refused, which he would later characterize as stubbornness, and which was in fact something considerably simpler. She was not stubborn. She simply knew something he did not, and she had not yet proven it, and proof was the only language that would be useful with George Holt. She went back to laying stones. The insulation layer between the stone walls and the surrounding earth was the last structural element, and she completed it in the second week of December, with her hands working slowly in the cold that pooled in the unfinished space. She used dry pine needles packed tight between the back face of the stone and the bare earth, topped with shredded wool from an old blanket that had given up its usefulness as a blanket but still had something to offer. The principle was the same one she had used to pack wounds in the field, air-trapped in small spaces. Resist both heat transfer and cold intrusion, and the material that traps it matters less than the fact of the trapping itself. The ventilation pipe she had cut from salvaged stovepipe in a section 18 inches long, angling it up through the foundation at 15 degrees so that it cleared the exterior wall 2 inches above the ground level. She packed the gap around it with clay and let it cure for 3 days before she trusted it. From outside, it looked like the lower end of a downspout, which was exactly what she intended. She built the sleeping platform from split cedar planks, the same material she had used for the original floor posts, raised 4 inches off the earthen floor and wide enough for 2 children to lie side by side without touching. She filled 2 ticking mattresses with wool scraps and flour sacks until they were thick enough to hold a body off the wood through a long night. She hung a small iron hook on the eastern wall for the oil lamp and set a shallow tin basin beside the platform for water. Then she went upstairs, put her dinner on, helped Lily with her reading lesson, and waited for a night cold enough to tell her whether any of it had worked. The night she had waited for arrived on the 14th of December, when the temperature outside dropped to 8 degrees before midnight, and the wind came down off the peaks with the particular edge it developed when the air above the mountains had been sitting still for days and then moved all at once. Ruth banked the cabin fire low, put on her heaviest coat, took the oil lamp and climbed down the ladder alone. The difference was immediate and physical, the kind of difference you feel in your body before your mind has finished accounting for it. The noise above was still audible, the wind and the creak of the log walls, but it had receded to a register that made it feel distant, belonging to a different world. The air in the underground room was still. Not stale, the vent pipe was doing its work, drawing a slow, steady exchange that kept the air clean without creating movement. The cold that had defined every room and every building Ruth had occupied since October was simply absent. She sat on the sleeping platform with her lamp and her thermometer and waited. The thermometer she had hung on the stone wall read 51 degrees when she arrived. Over the next 2 hours it rose to 53 as the stone gave back the warmth it had absorbed from the cabin above during the day. Outside through the vent pipe, the temperature continued to fall. She knew because she had left a second thermometer on the outside window ledge, and when she climbed up briefly to check it, it read 4 degrees. 49 degrees of difference between outside and inside, and the inside figure was still rising. She sat in the lamplight for a long time after that, long enough that the flame in the lamp had burned down to the halfway mark before she noticed. The stone walls held their temperature the way old stone always does, not with enthusiasm, not with drama, but with the patient, absolute reliability of mass. The vent breathed. The platform was dry. Nothing moved. She did not say anything to the empty room. She was not a woman who spoke her reliefs aloud when there was no one to hear them. But she sat there for the better part of an hour longer than she needed to, and when she finally climbed the ladder and replaced the trap door and smoothed the rug over it and went to bed, she slept without waking until the light came. She did not tell the children on the 15th or the 16th. She wanted a full cold snap to pass, wanted the reading of the thermometer over 3 consecutive nights to confirm what one night had suggested. She checked it each evening after the children were asleep, climbing down in her coat, with her lamp sitting for 20 minutes, climbing back up. The readings held 51, 52, 53 degrees. Outside, the temperatures ranged from 3 above zero to 12 below. The gap between the two numbers did not narrow. On the morning of the 18th, she told Lily and Thomas that she had something to show them. Lily stood at the top of the ladder and looked down with the expression of a child who has been asked to trust something she cannot fully see, which was a reasonable response and one that Ruth respected. Thomas climbed down immediately, the way he did everything without preliminary, without apparent concern for consequences, and landed on the platform with both feet and stood up straight and pressed one hand flat against the stone wall. "Grandma," his face turned up towards her at the top of the ladder, and his voice had in it the straightforward surprise of a child whose body has just reported something his expectations had not prepared him for. "It's not cold." Lily came down the ladder after that, stepping carefully, her hand on each rung. She sat on the platform and pulled the quilts up around her and opened the primer she had brought down with her, and she read by lamplight while Thomas pressed stones into the clay floor the way he had been pressing stones into every available surface since he could hold one, and Ruth sat between them with her coffee cup wrapped in both hands. They slept down there that night for the first time, all 3 of them, and Ruth lay awake after the children had gone still and listened to the silence that was not silence, the faint breath of the vent pipe, the distant sound of the wind doing its work on the world above, the absolute absence of the cold she had been fighting since October. Thomas did not cough once through the night. When Ruth woke at 4 in the morning, out of habit to check the fire, she lay for a moment confused by the warmth, and then she remembered where she was, and she put her hand flat on the stone wall beside the platform, the way Thomas had done, and she kept it there until she went back to sleep. January was 3 weeks away, and Ruth had no way of knowing what January intended to bring. What she knew was this: on the morning of the 10th, she walked out to the woodshed before breakfast to count her cordwood and on the way back, she stopped at the edge of the yard and looked north. The sky above the peaks was a blue so dark it was nearly purple, the specific deep color of high-altitude cold pressing down toward the valley. The air was perfectly still. No bird sounds. The aspens along the creek were motionless in a way that aspens almost never were, as though the wind had not merely stopped, but been removed from the world entirely. She stood in that stillness and breathed it in. The air had a quality she had not smelled since a January morning in 1864 outside Fredericksburg the morning before a storm came down from the Allegheny Highlands and killed 11 men in the field camp who had been alive and relatively healthy when they went to sleep the night before. The quality was not a smell exactly, it was more an absence, a scrubbed, clean emptiness in the air that meant the atmosphere above had been wrung of all its moisture and warmth and was preparing to deliver cold of a different order than what had come before. Ruth stood at the edge of her yard and understood what she was breathing. She went inside without her coffee, moved through the cabin quickly, and without the expression she reserved for the children when she wanted to convey that everything was ordinary. She checked the oil lamp in the underground room full. She checked the water barrel full. She brought down the remaining dried apples and the last of the cornmeal and the jerky she had put up in October. She filled the small iron box they used for heat storage with coals from the fire and took it down the ladder. Then she climbed back up, stood at the window, and watched the sky. The blue had deepened toward black at the northern horizon. The stillness held. Lily was braiding Thomas's hair into something he did not want braided and explaining to him in great detail why it was going to look fine. Thomas was making the face of a boy who has decided that protest is futile. Ruth looked at the sky one more time, then looked at her children. She was ready. The snow began before first light on the 11th of January, 1888, which meant that the men who stepped outside at dawn to assess it had already lost the best hours of calm. They came out of their cabins in the blue-gray morning with their coffee and their professional opinions, and they looked at the sky and looked at each other and made the judgments that men in agricultural settlements make about weather, comparative, historical, calibrated to experience. Light flakes, no wind to speak of, temperature holding around 15 degrees. Ordinary January behavior. Most of them went back inside and told their families it would pass by afternoon. Ruth did not go outside. She stood at the window and watched the snow fall into the stillness she had been watching since the previous morning, and she noted that it was falling straight down, which meant the wind had not arrived yet, and she understood that straight down snow in this kind of cold was not calm. It was a held breath. She spent the morning bringing in wood. Not the usual 2 armloads she kept stacked inside the door. She brought in 6, stacking them against the wall, past the point of convenience and into the range of what Lily called Grandma's serious face, which was the expression Ruth wore when she was working through a problem that had not yet declared itself fully. She filled both water barrels to their lips. She moved the remaining dried food stores down through the trap door and arranged them on the cedar planking beside the sleeping platform. She trimmed the oil lamp wick and filled the reservoir from the spare can and set it at the top of the ladder where she could reach it without having to search. Lily watched all of this from the table where she was doing her arithmetic. Thomas watched from the floor where he was doing nothing in particular with systematic concentration. Neither child asked questions because they had lived with their grandmother long enough to understand that her serious face was not an invitation for questions. It was an invitation for quiet helpfulness, which in Thomas's case meant staying out from underfoot, and in Lily's case meant finishing her arithmetic without being reminded. By noon, the wind had arrived. It did not arrive gradually. It came out of the north as though a door had been opened somewhere in the upper atmosphere, one moment absent, the next present, at full force, driving the falling snow horizontal and turning the valley into something that was no longer weather and had become instead a condition. Ruth felt the cabin lean into it, not physically, but acoustically, the logs taking on the low moan they produced when the wind found the north wall at sustained speed. The temperature outside dropped 4 degrees in an hour. By mid-afternoon, it had dropped 8 more. She kept the fire burning steady but not roaring. She was rationing now, even though the woodpile inside was full, because what was inside was what she had, and she did not yet know how long she would need it to last. By nightfall, the visibility through the window was less than 20 feet. The second day was harder. The wind did not rest overnight the way winter winds sometimes did, dropping to a manageable moan before gathering themselves for another run. This one blew continuously, and by the time the gray light came up on the 12th of January, the temperature outside had reached 14 below zero, and the drifts along the north wall of the cabin had built to window height. Ruth could not see the Holt property or the Walsh property or any structure in the settlement. The world beyond the cabin's walls had been replaced by white movement and a sound like sustained tearing. She went up to check the roof that morning, standing on the woodshed roof with a long-handled broom to pull the accumulated snow back from the eave line. The snow was dry and light, which was in her favor. Wet snow would have been heavier, but it had drifted unevenly, piling thick on the north pitch and leaving the south pitch relatively clear, and the unevenness was beginning to make itself felt in the ceiling boards above the main room, which had developed a faint but consistent creak that had not been there the day before. She worked for 20 minutes in the cold and then came inside and stood over the fire until her fingers could bend again. The cabin held its temperature at 38 degrees through the second day, with the fire going at a moderate burn. 38 was survivable but not comfortable, and she watched the children carefully for the signs. She was afraid of the whitening at the fingertips, the wet deepening of Thomas's cough, the particular stillness that preceded a fever. None of them appeared. She made hot cornmeal in the morning and hot broth at midday, and in the afternoon she told stories, not the educational kind she sometimes deployed for Lily's benefit, but the kind she rarely told, drawn from the years before she had come to Montana, when the world had been larger and stranger and considerably more violent than Bitterroot Creek. She told them about the field hospital at Cole Harbor, not the wounds and the dying, but the particular quality of the mud there, which was red clay under gray silt and which came off boots in layers like geologic time. She told them about the winter of '64, when she and 3 other nurses had kept a ward of 40 men alive through a week of temperatures that froze the supply wagons solid using blankets and body heat, and the determined refusal to acknowledge that the situation was impossible. She told them about the summer of '76 before Harold died, when they had found a bear in the root cellar, and the negotiation that followed. Lily laughed at the bear story. Thomas wanted to know who had won. "We both went away with what we needed," Ruth told him. "That's the best outcome in a negotiation." The third day, the drifts reached the top of the windows. By the fifth night, Ruth's woodpile inside the cabin had gone from 6 armloads to 2, and the stack outside in the shed had diminished at a rate she had not planned for, because the cold that had settled over the settlement was not the ordinary deep cold of a Montana winter night, but something of a different category, the kind that pulled heat out of structures and bodies, with a hunger that a well-built fire could match but could not exceed. She could keep the cabin at 38 degrees. She could not get it to 40. The fire was consuming itself in the effort to maintain that margin, and the margin itself was not enough to be safe. She did the accounting that night after the children were asleep, sitting at the table with her pencil and her flour sack calculations. At the current rate of consumption, she had 3 days of reasonable burning left. After that, she would be burning her furniture, and after the furniture was gone, she would have nothing, and the storm showed no sign of moderation. The wind had not dropped, the temperature had not risen. The snow continued to fall. She sat with her pencil for a long time, and then she put it down and did not pick it up again, because the conclusion she had reached did not require any further arithmetic. She went to the ladder and looked down through the trap door into the dark below, where the thermometer she had left on the stone wall glowed faintly in the reflected light from the cabin. 52 degrees, steady, unchanged by 5 days of the worst storm the settlement had seen in memory. The earth below her feet had not noticed any of this. It was holding its temperature with the complete indifference of something that had been doing this for longer than human records went back, and it would keep doing it until spring or until summer or until whatever came after summer, without variation or complaint. She did not hesitate. She had prepared for this, and she had hoped she would not need it, and now she needed it, and the gap between preparation and necessity closed without drama. She woke the children and wrapped them in every quilt and blanket in the cabin. She banked the fire low, not out, because a dead chimney in this cold would ice over, and the carbon monoxide risk on relight was not one she would accept with children in the space, just enough coals to keep the flue warm and the pipe clear. She loaded the lamp and took it down first, then came back for the water jug and the food she had stored above. Then she helped Thomas down the ladder, his blanket trailing behind him, and she steadied Lily on each rung, and when they were both on the platform, she came down last and pulled the trapdoor shut above her. The noise stopped. Not diminished, stopped. The wind that had been the ambient condition of their existence for 5 days was still there, still working on the cabin above them, but it had been reduced to something so distant and abstract that it could have been a sound from another building, another valley, another life. The air in the underground room was 51 degrees and absolutely still, and the oil lamp threw its steady light against the stone walls without flickering once. Thomas was asleep inside 4 minutes. He simply lay down on his side of the platform, pulled the quilt to his chin, and went out like a light that someone had turned low. His breathing was even and deep without the wet congestion that had been following him since November. Lily lay on her back for a while with her eyes open and the lamp close enough to read by, and she read for perhaps 20 minutes before the warmth and the quiet worked on her, the way they worked on everyone who came into that room out of the storm. Ruth sat beside them with her back against the stone wall and her hands around the water jug for warmth, and she listened to the silence, and for the first time in 5 days, she let her shoulders drop. She was not safe. She knew that. The cabin above her could fail. The vent could ice over. The lamp could run dry. She had thought through all of these contingencies and prepared for them as thoroughly as she could, and what remained after preparation was the thing that could not be engineered away. The fact of being a 63-year-old woman alone underground in a blizzard with 2 children, and the knowledge that no amount of planning changed the fundamental arithmetic of that situation. She had done what she could. The ground would do what it did. She put her head back against the stone and slept. The 6th morning was when she went upstairs and found that the fire had gone out. Not low, not struggling, out. The hearth was cold enough that when she touched the back wall of the firebox, the stone registered the same dead chill as the cabin walls around it. She stood in the main room with her lamp and understood what had happened before she looked during the night. The wind had shifted north-northeast, which was the one direction from which a strong, sustained gust could drive back down her chimney, past the damper, and the combination of the backdraft and the low-banked coals had simply extinguished what little was left. The chimney itself appeared clear, but when she lifted the damper handle, she heard the sound that confirmed her second suspicion, a high, thin whistle of air moving through a partial obstruction. Snow had packed into the flue above the roofline. The cabin temperature was 29 degrees. Her breath came in visible clouds. She stood and made her accounting quickly the way she had learned to move through emergencies, not catastrophizing, not minimizing, just the facts arranged in order of urgency. The obstruction had to be cleared before she could relight. Clearing the obstruction meant getting something up into the flue from below, which she could do with the long iron poker and the chimney brush she kept in the wood box. The relighting required dry fuel and an ignition source and patience. Her hands, which had been warm in the underground room 20 minutes ago, were already stiffening in the cabin's cold. She moved to the wood box and found the driest pieces split cedar. The inner face is still pale and powdery, the kind that caught from a spark rather than requiring sustained flame. She found the poker and worked it up into the flue in the careful spiral motion that cleared packed snow without compacting it further, and she felt the obstruction break loose in 3 distinct sections, each of them dropping a cold shower of snow crystals into the empty firebox. The whistle in the chimney stopped. She checked the damper, clear now, drawing clean. The ignition was the problem. Her hands had been frostbitten lightly in November. The outer 2 fingers of the right hand, and the cold found that weakness immediately and specifically the way cold always found its old work. By the time she had the tinder bundle arranged in the firebox, her right hand had gone from cold to painful to a specific deadened quality that she recognized and did not like. She shifted to her left hand for the flint work, which was slower and less accurate, and she struck sparks into the tinder for a long time before one of them caught and grew. She crouched over the small flame and fed it with the precise attention of someone who understood that this particular fire had to work, that there was no second attempt available, that the gap between a flame that survived and one that didn't was measured in fractions of a degree, and the steadiness of hands that were not entirely steady. She fed it cedar shavings, then small splits, then larger pieces, building the pyramid of heat upward, one layer at a time, and when she was certain it had enough mass to sustain itself, she sat back on her heels and looked at her right hand. The outer 2 fingers were white to the second joint. She pressed them against her chest under her coat and held them there against the warmth of her body, and she felt the pain begin as the blood came back, a deep grinding ache that she had felt before in the winter of '63 outside Fredericksburg, in the hands of men she had brought inside from picket duty. She was not losing the fingers. The color was returning unevenly, but returning. She would have full sensation back within the hour, and she would have a bruised, tender quality in those fingers for the next 2 weeks, and she would be more careful. She went back down the ladder and did not mention any of it to the children. The eighth night was the night she heard it. She had gone upstairs at what she estimated was 9 o'clock. Darkness fell early and stayed late, and had stopped being a useful measure of time to feed the fire its evening ration and check the roof and do the small maintenance that kept the cabin functional above the room where they were actually living. She had been underground most of the day, coming up twice, and the pattern had settled into something like routine, which was its own kind of danger because routine made you stop looking at things directly. She was at the top of the ladder with her hand on the trap door, about to go back down when she heard it. Not the wind. She knew the wind's vocabulary by now. Its different registers for different temperatures and speeds, its particular note against the log walls versus the chimney versus the woodshed. This was distinct from all of that. It had rhythm. A soft, deliberate, repeated impact against the cabin door muffled by the snow that had built up against it, but regular enough that a person had to be making it. She stood with her lamp and listened to make sure she was not constructing a sound from wind patterns, and then she heard it again, and it was unmistakably a knock. Not strong, not even very loud, but intentional, and sustained the knock of someone who had been knocking for some time and was continuing out of necessity rather than confidence. She crossed to the door and worked the bar out of its bracket, which required force because the cold had swollen the wood, and opened it against the resistance of the drift that had piled against the outside face. The cold came in like a physical object, solid and immediate. Behind it, barely visible in the lamp's throw of light, were 4 people. Jim Parson was in front. Ruth knew him, a solidly built man in his early 40s, who had the look of someone who had been very strong before whatever had happened to him in the past several days had used that strength up. He was standing technically, but the quality of his standing was not voluntary. He was upright because stopping upright was easier than the alternative, not because he had energy to spare for it. Behind him was his wife Clara, her arm around a girl bundled so completely in layers that only her face showed, the face too still and too pale for a child of 4. Behind Clara was their son Wade, 12 years old, with the expression of a boy who has been holding something together by will alone and is very close to the end of that resource. Jim's feet were wrong. Even through the layers of wrapping, Ruth could see that the boots were stiff, in a way that boots stiffen when the moisture inside them had frozen, and the way he shifted his weight off his left foot without appearing to realize he was doing it told her something she needed to know before he said a word. She stepped back from the door. She did not ask questions. There would be time for questions when they were inside, and no useful purpose was served by making 4 people stand in an open doorway in a 40-below wind chill while she gathered information. Clara came through first with the small girl. Nell. Ruth remembered she had seen the child at the Harvest Social in September, a lively, vocal 4-year-old who was currently doing nothing at all. Ruth took the child from Clara's arms without asking and carried her to the fire and pulled back the layers until she could see her hands and her face clearly. The girl's lips were the color of a winter sky. Her hands, when Ruth freed them from the wrapping, were cold, but not white cold, the way a child got who had been inadequately sheltered, not the specific dead white cold of tissue that had gone past the point of return. Ruth pressed the small hands between her own palms and watched the girl's face for response. Nell's eyes opened. They focused slowly, then more quickly, and then she said something that Ruth did not catch, and Clara, who had come up beside her, bent close and answered. Jim Parsons stood by the door and did not move toward the fire, which told Ruth that his feet were hurting enough that walking on them was something he was managing carefully. She got him to the bench and got the boots off, and what she found was what she had expected. Both feet had gone through a partial freeze and were in the early stages of rewarming on their own, the worst stage when the pain arrived to confirm that the tissue was still viable. His left foot was worse than his right. She packed both feet in the spare blanket she kept above the wood box and told him to stay off them, and he nodded with the obedience of a man who no longer had the capacity for disagreement. Their cabin's fire had gone out on the 7th night. They had burned through their wood supply by the sixth day, faster than anyone had planned for, because this cold required a fire that was essentially continuous and at a volume that peacetime estimates did not account for. When the fire went out, they had tried to wait it out under blankets, and by the morning of the eighth day, the interior temperature had dropped to the point where Clara could no longer feel Nell's hands, and Jim had made the decision that was the only decision available. He had tied a length of rope to the fence post outside their door and given the other end to Clara, and they had walked through the storm using the rope line to maintain direction until the rope ran out, and then Jim had kept going by compass, bearing a small brass compass he had carried since his army days. And they had reached Ruth's fence post by luck and bearing both, and Nell had stopped responding to her name in the last 100 yards. Ruth listened to all of this while she worked, and when it was told, she looked at the four of them, Jim with his damaged feet, Clara with the color coming back into her face but her hands still shaking, Wade standing near the wall with his arms crossed and his jaw set with an adolescent rigidity that was the only form of composure available to him, and Nell now awake and blinking at the fire with the bewildered alertness of a child who had been somewhere else and was slowly finding her way back. She had built the underground room for 3 people. It had 1 oil lamp and 1 sleeping platform and a ventilation pipe calculated for the air requirement of 3 bodies. She thought through the modifications quickly. The vent could be opened marginally further by adjusting the exterior end, which she could do from outside by removing the drainage cover and clearing the packing. The lamp oil would last 2 more days at current burn, and she had a partial reserve can. The platform was wide enough for 2 children side by side. An adult could sleep on the cedar floor planking with enough bedding. She thought about all of this for the time it took her to cross the room to the trap door and lift it. "We're going below," her voice carrying only what information was necessary. "All of us. Bring everything you're wearing." The descent required assistance for Jim, whose feet would not take full weight on the ladder rungs. Ruth went down first and caught his weight from below, and Wade guided him from above with a steadiness that made Ruth revise her estimate of the boy upward considerably. Clara came next with Nell, who by this point was awake enough to grip the rungs herself and narrate her progress in a whispered running commentary that was the most reassuring sound Ruth had heard in 8 days. The trapdoor came down. The wind disappeared. Jim Parsons sat on the platform with his back against the stone wall and his feet extended before him and looked at the thermometer Ruth had hung on the east face. The reading was 53 degrees. Outside, through the vent pipe's thin whisper of air exchange, the temperature continued to register in the range of 26 below zero, with wind that stripped the remaining margin off that number and turned it into something for which ordinary language was insufficient. Jim looked at the thermometer for a long time. "You built this," not a question. More like something a person says when they're taking stock of what's real. Ruth was arranging the bedding to fit 6 bodies instead of 3, which required a geometric logic she was working through without stopping. "I built it." He was quiet again. "Then how long?" "Since December." The stone walls were at 53 degrees, which in a space this size with 6 people breathing meant the temperature would rise. Ruth had not planned for this effect, but she understood it. Human bodies generate heat as a basic function of being alive, and in a sealed space that heat had nowhere to go. By the end of the first hour, the thermometer read 57. By the end of the second, it had reached 58 and leveled the vent, pulling just enough air to stabilize the balance. Nell fell asleep against Clara's side with the completeness of a child whose body had decided that the emergency was over and rest was now the priority. Wade sat on the floor planking with his knees pulled up and his back against the south wall, and after a while he began talking to Lily in the low, slightly formal way that 12-year-olds talk to 9-year-olds when they were trying to manage their own anxiety by being useful. Lily, who was not unaware of what was being managed, received this with the tact she had developed in the preceding year of living with a grandmother who did not explain everything. Thomas was asleep before Nell was. Jim's feet were the concern. Ruth checked them twice in the first 2 hours. The color was returning, which was good, and the pain he described when she pressed gently at the arch of his left of a foot was the clean pain of tissue that still had sensation, not the ambiguous numbness of something worse. She packed them again in dry wool and told him to move his toes every 30 minutes, and he did it with the disciplined compliance of a man who had received medical instructions before and understood the contractual nature of them. Clara watched Ruth work with an attention that was not passive. It was the attention of a woman cataloging information she intended to use. She looked at the walls and the vent and the platform and the lamp hook and the way the temperature held steady while the world above them did everything it could to argue otherwise. And she did not say anything for a long time. When she finally spoke, it was not about the cold or the storm or the children sleeping against each other on the platform. You built this before the storm. The word before carrying everything it needed to carry. Before November. Ruth was checking the vent adjustment, making sure the slight widening she had done on the interior end was drawing properly. I built it when the floor started freezing. Clara looked at the stone walls, which were holding their temperature the way stone holds everything, not generously, not warmly in any emotional sense, but with a permanence that generosity could not replicate. And nobody knew. George Holt knew I was digging. He told me heat didn't go down. Clara considered this. He was wrong. He'll arrive at that himself. Ruth came back to the platform and checked Nell's hands again, warm fingers curling naturally, color fully restored. Men like George Holt don't need to be told they're wrong. They need to see the evidence stacked high enough that the conclusion becomes unavoidable. The ninth day passed in the rhythm of the underground, the twice daily trips upstairs, the meals of cold cornbread and dried apple and jerky, the low-burning conversations in lamplight, the sound of children sleeping. Jim's feet improved enough on the ninth afternoon that he could bear weight on his right, and he insisted on accompanying Ruth for the evening fire check, which she allowed because having someone at the base of the ladder while she worked above was more practical than refusing the help on principle. On the morning of the 10th day, Ruth was in the cabin doing her fire check when the ceiling spoke. It was a sound she had been monitoring for 3 days, the intermittent creak of the roof structure under the accumulated snow load, and she had learned to distinguish between the ordinary settling sound that timber made under pressure and the different sound that timber made when the pressure was approaching the limit of what it was designed to bear. What she heard on the morning of the 10th was the second kind, a long, low, resonant creak from the main roof beam, followed by a silence in which she could almost hear the wood reconsidering its options, followed by a sharper crack from the eastern rafter joint. She went back down and got Jim. They worked for 2 hours, the two of them moving through the cabin in the 30-degree air, with their breath clouding ahead of them. The problem was the north pitch, the drift above it, had built to a depth that the roof had not been engineered to carry, and the main beam was showing a deflection at its center that had not been there when Ruth had last looked carefully 2 days ago. They could not get to the roof exterior in these conditions. What they could do was work from the interior. Jim cut 2 lengths from the spare timber Ruth kept in the woodshed for exactly this category of problem, a habit Harold had established and Ruth had maintained, and they set them as temporary posts under the main beam, one at each quarter point, shimming them tight with cedar wedges that Jim drove with the back of the hatchet. Ruth held each post plumb while he drove the wedges, and the work required her to stand with her arms overhead and her weight against the post for minutes at a stretch, which her shoulder informed her about in specific and ongoing terms. She did not mention the shoulder. When the posts were set, the beam stopped talking. The deflection remained. They could not fix that without removing the snow load, which was not an option, but it had been arrested, and the creak that had preceded it did not return. Jim ran his hand along the beam's underside and nodded with the judgment of a man who had built enough structures to know the difference between a beam that was failing and a beam that had found a new equilibrium. They went back down. Ruth did not tell Clara what they had found because Clara had enough to carry, but she caught Clara's eye when she came through the trap door, and Clara's expression said she understood that whatever had just happened above them had been serious and had been handled, and that was sufficient. The 11th day, the wind began to change pitch. Ruth had been listening to this wind long enough to know its voice in the way that long exposure to any sustained thing produces a knowledge that is more physical than intellectual. She heard the change not as information she analyzed, but as something she felt shift in the architecture of the sound above her. The sustained tearing note that had defined the past 11 days beginning to develop a different quality, a slight unevenness, as though the engine driving it was not failing, but varying. She did not say anything. She had been wrong about weather before. She was not wrong this time. The 12th morning came with a silence so complete after 11 days of continuous wind that Ruth woke from a shallow sleep, convinced for a disoriented moment that she had gone deaf. She lay on the floor planking where she had been sleeping, wrapped in the last of the quilts, and she listened to the nothing and understood it slowly. Thomas was breathing quietly on the platform above her. Jim's feet shifted on the cedar boards. The vent pipe, which had been carrying the wind's sound as a faint harmonic throughout the storm, was making no sound at all. She climbed the ladder alone. The cabin was cold, 24 degrees, and the fire had burned to coals, but the coals were still alive, and when she opened the damper and fed them, they caught the new wood without resistance. She went to the window and looked out. The snow was blinding in the early light, a flat white surface broken by the dark lines of fence posts and the curved forms of buried structures, and above it all, a sky so blue and hard and clear that it looked like something that had been made rather than something that had simply arrived. The peaks to the north were completely visible for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, sharp and white against the blue, their faces scoured clean. The thermometer on the outside window ledge read 10 below zero. Cold, but the wind had gone, and 10 below without wind was a different country entirely from 10 below, with the wind that had been running for 11 days. She went back down the ladder and stood at the bottom and looked at 5 people sleeping in the room she had built from a flour sack calculation and a memory of red Virginia mud and the specific stubbornness of a woman who could not afford to be wrong. It's over. Just those 2 words pitched for anyone who was already drifting toward waking. Jim opened his eyes first, then Clara. Lily sat up with her book still open in her lap, which meant she had fallen asleep reading again. Thomas took somewhat longer, having committed to his sleep with his customary thoroughness. Wade was already on his feet by the time Thomas surfaced with the controlled energy of someone who had been waiting for permission to stop holding still. They came up through the trap door one by one into the cold cabin in the thin winter light, and then Ruth opened the front door against the drift that had built against it, and the light came in real light, the first actual sunlight they had seen since the storm began, bouncing off the snow with an intensity that made everyone squint. Lily and Thomas went outside immediately, their boots punching through the crust into the powder beneath, and the sounds they made were the sounds of children who had been given back the sky. Nell stood in the doorway and looked at the white world with the white, deliberate attention of a 4-year-old taking careful inventory of a landscape she had last seen when it was a different place. Then she stepped off the threshold into the snow and sat down in it deliberately and looked up at Clara with an expression that suggested this was acceptable and perhaps even preferable. Jim stood at the edge of the cleared threshold with his weight distributed carefully between his 2 feet, his left still tender, his right bearing most of the load, and he looked at the settlement. One structure to the south had lost part of its roof. The Hennessy place, which sat at the low end of the creek, was completely buried to the eave line. The cottonwoods along the water had been stripped of their smaller branches, and the snow-covered shapes of things that had been stacked outside lumber tools. Cordwood lay in forms that would not be recognizable until the thaw revealed them. He stood in the sunlight and looked at all of it for a long time, and then he turned back to the cabin behind him at the door at the window that was still crusted with ice on the inside, at the thin line of smoke beginning to rise from the chimney as the fire found its footing again. Clara peered at his shoulder. She looked at the same things he was looking at, and then she looked at Ruth, who was standing to the side with her hands in her coat pockets and the squinting expression of someone letting their eyes readjust to full light after 11 days of lamplight. People are going to ask questions, Clara's voice carrying the knowledge that this was an understatement of considerable proportions. Ruth looked at the settlement, at the buried shapes in the cracked chimney she could see from here on the Holt property's roofline, at the tracks Jim and Wade were already making toward the fence line, as Jim tested his feet against real distance. Let them. The words came without hesitation because she had been a woman who answered questions directly for 63 years and saw no reason to change the practice now. But she was looking north as she said it, north toward the road that came in from the county seat, the road that Deputy Mercer's horse had last traveled in November. And she was thinking about his notebook in his careful clerk's hand and the notation he had made about structural modifications and the filing deadline he had mentioned, which was the 15th of December, which had come and gone while Ruth was laying stone in the underground room and spreading excavated dirt across a frozen garden. The deadline had passed. The storm had passed. And somewhere in the county seat, a man with a leather satchel had a notation in his records that needed to be addressed. The questions that were coming were not all of the same kind. The first person to knock on Ruth's door after the storm was Edna Walsh, which was not surprising because Edna Walsh was the first person to knock on most doors in the settlement when something needed to be assessed. She came with her jar of beef broth and her expression of carefully managed concern, and she found what she found: two children with pink cheeks playing in the yard, a cabin that had not been gutted for fuel, a woodpile that still had weight to it. Ruth saw the confusion move across Edna's face in real time, the way a woman's expression changes when the evidence in front of her does not match the story she had already written on the walk over. Edna stepped inside and stood in the main room and turned around, slowly taking her accounting. The walls were sound, the furniture was intact. There was no smell of burnt wood that wasn't firewood, no charred table legs, no dismantled bed frame. The cabin had the tired quality of a space that had been through something hard, but had come through it with its structure preserved, and the warmth in the room was the warmth of an active fire rather than the desperate warmth of a fire being asked to compensate for conditions it could not fix. "How much wood did you burn?" Edna's voice had the quality of someone asking a question they believe will answer several other questions simultaneously. Ruth looked at the shed through the window. The pile was diminished but not desperate. Considerably more remained than she had expected to have at this point, because 11 days of underground living had required only the twice-daily maintenance burns above rather than the sustained maximum effort burning that had depleted every other homestead on the creek. "Less than I planned for," she told Edna, which was true and also not the full truth, and she let the gap between those two things sit in the air while Edna worked out what she wanted to ask next. What Edna wanted to ask, it turned out, was everything. She sat at the table and she listened to Ruth explain the underground room with the attentive stillness of a woman who is reorganizing everything she thought she knew about a subject while the new information comes in. She did not interrupt. She asked one clarifying question about the vent pipe, which was the right question, and when Ruth answered it, she nodded once and was quiet again. When Ruth finished, Edna sat for a moment with her hands around the coffee cup Ruth had placed in front of her, and then she said with the directness that Ruth had always respected in her, "I want to see it." Ruth moved the rug and opened the trap door, and Edna went down the ladder with the careful deliberateness of a woman in her late 50s who had decided that her dignity was less important than her information. She stood in the underground room for several minutes, pressing her palm against the stone wall, checking the temperature on the thermometer, looking up at the floor above her, where the lamplight came through the gaps in the planking. When she came back up, she was quiet in the specific way of someone whose mind is working faster than their mouth. She left an hour later, carrying the broth she had brought, which Ruth had refused because the broth was needed elsewhere, and Ruth's larder, though reduced, was adequate. At the fence, she stopped and looked back at the cabin and at the thin smoke rising from the chimney and at the two children in the yard, and she stood there long enough that Lily looked up from what she was doing and waved. Edna waved back and then kept walking, and by the time she reached George Holt's property, she had already decided what she was going to say. George Holt came alone 2 days after the storm broke. He did not send his wife first and come behind her the way some men did when they were uncertain of their reception. He came directly in the middle of the afternoon, and he stood at the fence for a moment before he came through the gate, which Ruth observed from the window, and which told her that he had thought carefully about what he intended to say and was deciding at the last moment whether to say it. He came in and stood near the door, turning his hat in his hands. He was a man who was competent in almost every practical domain and entirely at ease in nearly every social situation, and his discomfort now was visible precisely because it was so unusual on him. He looked at the rug over the trapdoor, and he looked at Ruth, and he did not begin with any of the approaches men typically used when they were building toward an apology: the qualifications, the contextualizing, the reframing of their original position as almost correct. He said, "I was wrong about the heat. I want to understand why." Ruth pulled the other chair out from the table, and he sat, and she explained. Not the version she had given Edna, which had been a practical overview. This was the version that started with the physics and moved outward: how convection behaved differently in sealed spaces than in open ones, how thermal mass in stone absorbed and released heat on a time delay that decoupled it from the air temperature above, how the absence of air movement was itself a form of insulation that no amount of wall batting could replicate, because wall batting addressed conductance, but not convection loss. She drew it on the back of a piece of wrapping paper with a stub of pencil. The heat moving through the system as arrows, the stone walls as a buffer, the ground temperature at depth as a baseline that the system rested on. George leaned over the drawing and did not speak while she talked. His hands, which had been working his hat brim, went flat on the table. He was a man who thought in three dimensions, in joints and load paths, and the behavior of materials under stress, and she could see him translating what she was saying into the spatial language that was native to him. When she finished, he studied the drawing for a while, and then he looked at her with an expression that was complicated in the particular way that genuine intellectual revision was complicated, not embarrassed exactly, but aware of the distance between where he had been and where he was now, and aware that the distance had been crossed on someone else's map. "You're a better builder than I am, Mrs. Calloway." He said it without performance, the way a craftsman acknowledged another craftsman's superior work, not as a social gesture, but as a professional assessment. "I don't say that easily." Ruth took the drawing back and looked at it. "You would have arrived at the same place if you'd had the same problem to solve." She meant it. George Holt was not a man who made the same error twice, and the error he had made was not one of intelligence, but of circumstance. He had never had a cold floor and two sick children and no margin for a winter that wasn't going to cooperate. "The difference is I had more reason to think it through." He stayed another hour. He asked specific questions about the stone selection, the vent angle, the insulation material behind the walls. He had the questions of someone who was already planning, not asking abstractly, and before he left, he asked if she had a copy of the drawing he could keep. Ruth made him a second one, more detailed, with measurements added from memory. He folded it carefully and put it in his coat pocket and shook her hand at the door, a formality he extended to almost no one, which Ruth understood was his way of filing the apology one in a form more durable than words. The community's reaction to what Ruth had done was not uniform, and she would not have trusted it if it had been. Uniform reactions were the product of social pressure rather than genuine assessment, and social pressure produced agreement that evaporated the moment conditions changed. What she got instead was a range that ran from Edna Walsh's immediate practical engagement through the measured reconsideration of men like George Holt to the skepticism of the settlement's more conservative voices. The men who had survived previous hard winters through stubbornness and wood, and regarded this as proof that stubbornness and wood were sufficient, and who were not wrong exactly, only working from a sample size that didn't include the winter they had just been through. Jim Parson told his version of the story without embellishment, which was the most persuasive kind. He stood outside the general store on the first day the road was passable, and he told the men gathered there what the underground room had held at 53 degrees, while the storm ran what it had felt like to come in out of 26 below zero and walk down a ladder into the warmth of the earth, what Nell had looked like when they arrived and what she had looked like 12 hours later. He was not a dramatic speaker. The flatness of his delivery was its own argument, a man recounting facts he had personally verified without the rhetorical inflation that would have made them easier to dismiss. The general store clerk came by on the third day after the storm. He came without merchandise, which was itself a statement, and he stood in the main room with his coat still on and asked how warm the underground room had been on the worst nights. When Ruth told him, his face changed in the way that George Holt's face had changed, the specific recalibration of a man who has been using the wrong figure in a calculation and has just been given the correct one. His own cabin, he said, had not cleared 45 degrees with the stove running at capacity for 11 days. He stood in silence for a moment, doing the arithmetic that the difference between 45 and 53 implied when you multiplied it across 11 days and two children. He asked if he could see the room. Ruth showed him. He stood on the platform and looked at the stone walls and the lamp hook and the vent pipe running up through the foundation, and he was very quiet, the quiet of a man constructing something in his mind. When he climbed back up, he asked three questions: how deep, what kind of stone, how did she keep the children from being afraid in the dark? The third question surprised her. She told him the lamp helped and that children who were warm enough to sleep were not generally afraid of the dark. He wrote something in the small notebook he kept in his vest pocket and thanked her. 3 days after that, Wade Parson appeared at Ruth's fence with a question his father had sent him to ask whether it was acceptable to copy the vent pipe design or whether she had a preference about that. Ruth told him to tell his father that the design belonged to anyone who could use it. Wade wrote this down with the seriousness of a boy carrying an official message and went back the way he had come, and Ruth watched him go and thought about what it meant that Jim Parson had sent his 12-year-old son to ask permission, which was a form of respect that cost something to extend, and that she received without comment. Deputy Mercer arrived on the fourth day after the storm, riding in from the county road on a horse that had earned its rest, his leather satchel over his shoulder, and his neat brown beard slightly less kempt than it had been in November. He came to Ruth's door in the mid-morning and took off his hat when she opened it, which was either politeness or prelude to official business, and in Ruth's experience, the two were not mutually exclusive. She had expected him. She had expected him since the storm broke, in fact had been tracking the days between the roads becoming passable, and this knock on her door with the same attention she gave to tracking weather, because the legal thread he had left hanging in November had not resolved itself simply because a blizzard had intervened. Deadlines in territorial land law did not pause for weather, and the filing period he had mentioned had closed on the 15th of December, and Ruth had not filed anything. He came in and sat at the table, and he opened the satchel, and he took out his notebook, and he was professional and courteous and entirely serious about the matter before him. He had received, he explained, 2 reports from neighboring claim holders, noting what appeared to be structural modifications to the Callaway Homestead Foundation, and his November notation in the record had flagged the property for follow-up review. The Territorial Land Office required a formal description and inspection of any below-grade modification to a homestead structure. The filing period had closed without submission. This created a compliance issue. Ruth listened to all of this without changing her expression. She had been listening to official language for a long time, had spent 2 years in field hospitals, where official language was used to distribute morphine and assign burial detail, and she knew the difference between language that was describing a problem and language that was building toward a specific conclusion. Mercer's language was describing a problem. He had not yet told her where he intended it to land. She asked if he wanted to see it. He said yes. He went down the ladder with more ease than Edna had managed, and considerably more than Ruth had expected, and he moved through the underground room with a methodical attention that was different from George Holt's craftsman's eye and different from Edna's practical inventory. He was looking at the room the way a government official looked at a thing he was trying to classify, trying to find the category it belonged to, the regulation it triggered, the form it required. He checked the vent pipe entry through the foundation. He measured the approximate dimensions by stepping them off. He ran his hand along the stone wall the way Mercer did, almost everything carefully without apparent emotion. He came back up and opened his notebook. Ruth stood by the window and waited. Outside, Lily and Thomas were in the yard, Lily reading on the bench, Thomas engaged in an excavation project of his own in the thawing ground near the garden border. The afternoon light was the low gold light of a January sun that had very little heat in it, but considerable beauty, and it lay across the snow in long shadows that made the yard look like something from a painting. Mercer looked at his notebook, and then he looked at the trap door, and then he looked at the 2 children through the window. He was quiet for long enough that Ruth began to understand that his calculation was more complicated than she had initially read it. He was not simply a man with a form to fill. He was a man with a form to fill who had just walked through the room that had kept 3 adults and 3 children alive in a storm that had killed a man down the creek and frostbitten half the settlement's able-bodied men. He looked back at his notebook. He turned to a fresh page. "I'll need to file this as an existing structure," his voice carrying the particular precision of a man choosing his words for their legal weight. "Under the territorial code, structures predating the December filing period are eligible for retroactive description. You'll need to submit a written account of the construction, dimensions, materials, purpose to the County Land Office by the 1st of April. Ruth looked at him. Not a violation, a documentation requirement. He wrote something on the fresh page. For existing structures, the process is administrative rather than punitive, provided the construction doesn't compromise the primary claim's integrity. He looked up. This doesn't compromise it. If anything, he stopped. Started again. The structure is sound. He was closing the notebook when he paused and looked back at her with the expression of a man deciding something that was not precisely official business. "Mrs. Callaway, do you have a drawing of the design, the dimensions, the vent arrangement?" Ruth studied him. Why, he met her eyes with the straightforward quality of a man who has decided that the official context of this visit and the human context of what he has just seen do not have to be entirely separate things. "My sister lives in Billings. Her cabin floor has been freezing since October. She has 2 boys under 7. He paused. "I'd like to send her something useful. Ruth went to the writing table and took out paper and a pencil, and she drew what she knew: the dimensions, the stone coursing the vent angle, the insulation packing the trapdoor dimensions. She added notes in her careful, practical hand, the hand of a nurse who had written field reports in low light for 2 years and had learned to make every word carry its full load. She handed it to him when it was done. He folded it and put it inside his coat against his chest, where it would not be folded further or damaged. He put his hat back on and shook her hand at the door, and rode out the way he had come, and the compliance issue he had arrived with rode out with him, reclassified but resolved. George Holt came back on a Saturday in late January, and this time he brought the drawing Ruth had given him, now covered in his own additions measurements, converted to standard lumber dimensions. The vent pipe redrawn with the fitting specifications he had sourced from the hardware catalog, the insulation layer labeled with alternative materials for homesteaders who couldn't access the creek bedstone. He had been working on it for 2 weeks, and what he had produced was the translation of Ruth's practical knowledge into the language of someone who built things for a living, more precise, more reproducible, more useful to the hands of people who had not spent 6 months thinking through the original problem the way she had. They sat at her table and went through it together, and Ruth corrected 2 assumptions he had made about the foundation clearance and confirmed everything else. It was the most productive hour she had spent with another person on a practical matter since Harold had been alive, and the fact that it was with a man who had laughed at her 2 months ago made it neither more nor less useful. Usefulness was usefulness. Edna Walsh could not dig under her cabin because her property sat on a shallow soil layer over bedrock that stopped a spade at 18 inches. She had come to terms with this quickly and moved on to the next available option, which was what Edna Walsh did with obstacles in general. She built a sleeping addition on the north side of her cabin, half buried into the slope of the hill, stone walls on 3 sides, a sod roof packed with pine duff, the interior temperature, something Ruth estimated would run in the low 40s rather than the 50s, but would hold that through any wind short of the one they had just survived. It was not the underground room. It worked. Edna's youngest did not develop the foot sores he had gotten through the previous 2 winters. Jim Parson began digging in February, working around the ongoing tenderness in his left foot with the systematic stubbornness of a man who had decided that next winter was not going to catch him the way this one had. His right foot had recovered completely. His left would take until May to feel fully reliable, which did not stop him from getting on his knees in the excavated space and laying stone the way Ruth had shown him, course by course, with Wade passing stones down from above and keeping a running commentary on their quality that was part assessment and part the kind of talk a 12-year-old made to fill the silence when he was doing something he had decided mattered. By the end of January, 3 families along Bitterroot Creek had begun construction. By the time the February thaw softened the ground enough to make digging easier, 5 more were planning. Not everyone was persuaded. There were homesteaders who looked at the numbers and the evidence and returned to their conclusion that wood and stubbornness had served them well enough, and they were not wrong to believe this, only working from a narrower margin than they recognized. The difference now was that there was a choice where before there had only been the one approach repeated with varying degrees of desperation each winter, refined at the edges but identical in its fundamental dependence on the fire as the only answer to the cold. Ruth did not advocate. She answered questions when they were asked and showed the room when people requested it and let the accumulated evidence of 12 days underground speak for itself. The room had held its temperature. The children were healthy. The woodpile had outlasted the storm by what any honest accounting would describe as a significant margin. These were not arguments. They were facts arranged in a sequence that allowed people to draw their own conclusions, and the conclusions when drawn were durable, in the way that self-arrived conclusions always were. The first week of February was when Ruth stopped being able to stand up easily in the morning. It came without announcement the way the body's accounting always did not, as a dramatic event, but as a morning when the dizziness that had been occasionally present for the past week was more present than usual, and the ache in her chest that she had been attributing to the cold and the exertion of the post-storm weeks refused to resolve the way a muscle ache resolved. She sat on the edge of the bed and waited for it to pass, which it did partially after several minutes. She stood carefully and made her way to the stove and got the fire going and sat in the chair closest to it with her hands wrapped around a cup of water heating on the grate. The children were still asleep. The cabin was quiet. Ruth sat in the early light, and took stock of her situation the way she had taken stock of difficult situations her entire adult life, not minimizing, not catastrophizing, simply listing what was true. She was 63 years old and she had dug an underground room from frozen earth, with a bum shoulder managed a blizzard for 11 days, reinforced a failing roof in 29-degree air, with inadequate hand function, and absorbed the accumulated sleep deficit of 2 months of light sleeping, midnight fire checks, and the specific exhaustion of sustained watchfulness that had no release. The dizziness and the chest ache were not mysterious. They were the body's response to work that had exceeded its reserves, spread over time, and now calling in its debt. She fed the fire and woke the children and made breakfast and got through the morning on the momentum of routine, which was a force not to be underestimated. It was not until midday when Lily looked at her across the table during the reading lesson and asked if she was all right that Ruth understood her face was saying something she had not given it permission to say. She told Lily she was tired. This was both true and not the full truth, and Lily was 9 years old and perceptive enough to know it and young enough to accept the partial answer without pressing. Thomas looked up from his stones, checked Ruth's face with his direct assessing gaze, and returned to his project. He was 6. He had been watching his grandmother for signs of trouble since his mother died, with the vigilance of a child who understood at a cellular level that the adults in his life were not unlimited resources. By the following morning, she could not stand without steadying herself against the wall. Clara Parson was at the door within an hour of Lily leaving to find her. Ruth did not remember sending the child because she had not sent her. Lily had made the decision herself with the judgment of a girl who had spent the past year learning to read the gap between what her grandmother said and what her grandmother meant, and who had decided that this particular gap was too wide to leave unaddressed. Clara came in and looked at Ruth in the chair by the stove and did not waste time on the question of whether the situation was serious. She went back to the door and called something to Wade, who had walked Lily back and was waiting in the yard, and then she came in and took off her coat and began. She was at the cabin for 3 hours, and before she left, she had arranged things in the particular way that a capable woman arranged things when she had decided that a situation required management, rather than sympathy, firewood inside water barrel, full children fed, and a schedule established for who would come and when. Edna Walsh arrived that afternoon with food. George Holt's wife Margaret came the following morning with a tin of good tea and stayed to split the wood that had been left unsplit outside. Jim Parson sent Wade over every second day with whatever the Parson larder could spare, which was more than it should have been given that they were managing their own winter on a woodpile that was only now being rebuilt. Ruth received all of this from the bed with the discomfort of a woman whose primary mode of relating to other people had been competent provision and who now found herself on the other end of that transaction. She was not gracious about it immediately. She told Edna on the second day that she was well enough to manage her own fire, which was approximately true, and Edna told her that managing it yourself and having someone else manage it were both options, and she was choosing the latter. And Ruth looked at the ceiling and said nothing further on the subject. Clara came every afternoon. She sat in the chair by the bed and talked and listened with the equitable distribution of the two that characterized her company. And on the 4th day, Ruth said, without particularly intending to, "I'm not used to this." Clara was quiet for a moment. She had over the past weeks developed the quality of silence that genuine attention produced, not the silence of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but the silence of someone who had decided that what was being said deserved more space than an immediate response would give it. Neither were we, but we learned. She said it without performance, the way someone said something they had arrived at through experience rather than reflection. "You showed us that the ground could hold what we couldn't hold by ourselves. I suppose that goes for people too." Ruth looked at the window where the February light was doing its pale work on the snow outside. She had spent the past 4 months building something that could sustain 3 bodies through cold, that no individual effort could resist the stone holding the heat, that the fire provided the earth holding the stone, the structure holding them all. She had understood this as physics. Clara was suggesting it extended further than physics. Ruth was not certain she disagreed. Thomas came and sat on the bed beside her on the 5th day and did not say anything for a long while, just sat with his particular concentrated stillness, his small hands quiet on the quilt. Then he looked at her with his direct 6-year-old gaze and said, "Are you going to be better?" Ruth looked at him for a moment. Yes, she said it as a fact because she intended it to be one, and because the alternative was not something she was willing to consider while a child was watching her face for information about the stability of his world. It takes time. He accepted this with a nod and sat a while longer beside her, his presence steady and uncomplicated in the way that only a child's presence could be, and Ruth found that it was enough. She was on her feet properly by the end of February, first short distances around the cabin, then the yard, then the longer walk to the woodshed and back. The dizziness had receded to an occasional presence that arrived when she moved too quickly and departed when she stood still for a moment. The chest ache had resolved almost completely, leaving in its place the general tiredness that she recognized as the body's final passage through a long recovery, not sick, not well yet, moving through the territory between. She went down the ladder into the underground room for the first time since falling ill on a quiet afternoon in early March alone, when the children were at the Walsh cabin learning a quilting pattern from Edna that Thomas had shown surprising interest in. The room was 50 degrees. The deep winter had pulled it down 2 degrees from its midwinter high, but the stone had held its thermal mass through the coldest months without significant loss, which was what stone at this depth and mass reliably did. It would rise back toward 53 by April as the ground above it began to absorb the spring's lengthening days. She sat on the platform with her back against the east wall, the wall she had rebuilt after the collapse, the wall she had set differently than she had planned, and that had been better for it. She stayed for a while in the quiet, letting the room be what it was without trying to make anything of it, and then she climbed back up to start the evening meal. By the winter of 1889, 9 structures along Bitterroot Creek incorporated some version of what Ruth had built. George Holt had dug his room to the full specifications following the drawing they had refined together and reported to anyone who asked that his firewood consumption had dropped nearly in half. He had also built 2 additional rooms for neighboring families at cost, not free, because George Holt believed that work had value and that devaluing it served no one but at a price that reflected the fact that he was helping people stay alive rather than building a luxury. Edna Walsh's hillside addition had been copied by the Hennessy family on the lower property, who could not dig deep either, but could cut into the slope. Lily left for Idaho at 22, following a school teacher she had met at a territorial education conference in Missoula, and when she arrived at the property, they had claimed she dug the underground room before the first snowfall. She did not call it an innovation. She called it the thing you did before winter came, the way you put up preserves before autumn, or repack the log chinking before the cold. It was not something she had learned so much as something she had absorbed the way children absorbed the essential practical knowledge of the people who raised them through proximity and repetition and the inarguable evidence of what worked. Thomas became a stonemason. He worked in Missoula and later in Helena building schools and public buildings and 2 courthouses, and he became known in his trade for suggesting partially buried foundations and earth-sheltered north walls in a way that other masons did not. When clients or other builders asked him why, he said, "The ground holds heat that the air won't." He said it without attribution, not because he had forgotten where he had learned it, but because he had lived with it long enough that it had stopped being a thing he had been taught and had become a thing he simply knew, which was the measure of knowledge that was worth having. William Draper came into Ruth's life in the spring of 1894 as the Territorial School Board's newly appointed administrator for the Northern District. He was 51, a widower, a man who had spent his adult life in classrooms and school board meetings and did not know how to split firewood without instruction. He learned. He was better at it by the end of his first Montana winter than most men who had been doing it for decades, because he was accustomed to learning things thoroughly when he had decided they were worth knowing, which was the quality that had made him a reasonable teacher and a better administrator. On his first deep cold night in the cabin, Ruth showed him the underground room. He went down the ladder and sat on the platform and looked at the stone walls and the vent pipe and the lamp hook and the thermometer on the east wall. He sat for a long time. When he came back up, he sat at the table with his hands on the surface in front of him, and he said, "I spent 40 years in buildings that burned everything they had and were still cold." He stopped, started again. "And you built this with a shovel." Ruth looked at him. "And stones from the creek." "And stones from the creek." He was quiet in the considering way that had become, in the months she had known him, one of the qualities she valued most in him, not the silence of a man with nothing to add, but the silence of a man who was taking something seriously enough to be still with it. I should have been a worse teacher and a better digger. Ruth thought about Harold, who had been a good man and a careful builder, who had raised the floor on cedar posts to protect it from moisture, and had not in all his careful building considered what that raised floor would do to the winter cold that moved beneath it. She thought about the men along the creek who had burned their furniture and blackened their fingers and gotten their families through hard winters through sheer committed stubbornness, which was its own kind of strength and not one she would diminish. She thought about George Holt, who had been wrong and had said so and had then gone away and done the work of being right. You would have arrived at it, she told William, given the right problem. He looked at the rug over the trap door. You're more charitable than the evidence warrants. The evidence, Ruth told him, is that you're sitting here asking the right questions instead of telling me why it can't work. That's a better starting place than most. The spring of 1895 was the spring that Bitterroot Creek got its first school building with a partially buried foundation designed to Thomas Calloway's recommendations and built to George Holt's specifications. It was a small building, 2 rooms, and it stayed warm enough through the winters that followed on a fraction of the firewood the previous one-room school had burned. The children who attended it grew up thinking of buried foundations as the ordinary way that buildings in cold climates were built, because to them it was the ordinary way, and they would carry that assumption west and north and into the next century without particularly marking it as an assumption. Ruth lived at the cabin until 1901, when her hip made the ladder into the underground room impractical, and she moved into Missoula to live near Thomas and his wife. The cabin stood for another 15 years after she left it, and the underground room remained beneath its floor, throughout used by successive occupants who knew what it was and used it as designed, and eventually by occupants who did not know its history, but used it anyway because it was there and it was warm. On the last evening she spent in the cabin before the move to Missoula, Ruth sent William ahead with the first load in the wagon and stayed behind to close up the place. She moved through the rooms in the late afternoon light, checking window latches, banking the fire, touching the surfaces of things she had lived with long enough that they had become extensions of her own physical knowledge of the world. Then she moved the rug, lifted the trap door, and went down the ladder one last time. The room was 51 degrees. The vent breathed. The stone walls were the same granite and basalt she had pulled from the Bitterroot Creek bed 14 years before, and they had not shifted or settled in any direction since the night she had rebuilt the east wall after the collapse. The wall she had set in the dark after failure with no one to help her and no option but to continue. She ran her hand along its face now, the way she had pressed her hand flat against it on the night she first confirmed the room would hold, and the stone gave back the same steady warmth it always had, unhurried and absolute. She sat on the platform for a while. The children were gone, grown and elsewhere, living the lives that had been the entire point of everything. The storm was 14 years past and had been replaced in local memory by subsequent storms and subsequent recoveries, the way all specific events were eventually generalized into the ongoing fact of winter in a place that took winter seriously. She had not spoken of that January to anyone in several years, not because it was forgotten, but because it had been absorbed into the walls of 9 underground rooms, into the calculation of every family that now banked its wood estimates differently, into the knowledge of a generation of children who grew up thinking that the ground was something to work with. She sat in the quiet and the warmth and let herself simply be where she was. The stone held its heat. The earth held the stone. The silence was the silence of a depth that wind had never reached and never would. She was not a woman who marked endings with ceremony. She climbed the ladder, replaced the trap door, smoothed the rug over it one last time, and walked out of the cabin and closed the door behind her. The wagon was waiting at the fence. The afternoon light lay long and gold across the snow that still held in the shadows of the north slope, the places where winter kept its last grip until April insisted otherwise. She walked to the wagon and got up beside William, and he asked if she was ready, and she said yes, and they drove down the road toward Missoula in the late light without looking back, because the thing she had built did not require her presence to continue doing what it did, which was the best thing that could be said of any work a person left behind.